I am Flavia Bellieni Zimmermann from the Australian Institute of International Affairs in Western Australia, and today we have with us Murdoch University Asia Research Centre Professor Garry Rodan, and we'll be discussing conflict and political participation in Southeast Asia. Thank you for being with us, Professor.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Professor, can you please explain to us how conflict has influenced political participation in Southeast Asia?
As elsewhere, conflicts are multiple, but in Southeast Asia, where we've had a period of sustained, rapid capitalist development, lots of social transformations, lots of issues about whether the distribution of the benefits and costs of development have been fair or adequate to people's aspirations. Well, that's a context within which, across most of the region, there are conflicts of slightly different complexions, playing out slightly differently, but fairly uniform. And participation, of course, in most political institutions, whether they be formal or informal, is meant to try and address conflict or redress conflict or contain conflict. It's one of the big points in my book that not everybody enters into political participation with the same ideas. There is inevitably an acceptance that not everyone can win out of the decisions that come from political conflict, but there are attempts by different participants to project that everyone's a winner, and maybe they're not all winners.
Thank you. And more specifically, how political participation, as you're explaining, has had an impact in democracy in Southeast Asia?
Well, some would argue there hasn't had enough impact. I'd be one of those. I think what we've missed is if we continually look for signs of democracy as a consequence of political participation, or if we evaluate political participation solely in terms of whether or not it's democratic, then we might be missing some of the most important dynamics in the region, and indeed many other places. That is that a lot of political participation is either instigated as a way of presenting an alternative to democracy, or as an attempt to supplement democracy. It can be one or other, and the focus of my book is really on looking at those forms of participation that are often dismissed because they're not democratic, but they are proliferating, and they are just as important as forms of participation that are democratic. So that's really one of the specific contributions I'm trying to make here, is to say we can't dismiss things just because they're not democratic. We need to understand them. Why are they emerging? Who supports them? Who opposes them? What's the state of play in that struggle?
Thank you very much. And to which extent do you think that the way political participation is evolving in Southeast Asia, it might be perhaps an evolution towards democracy?
I think that would be, in some cases that may be happening, but I think if that's your general blueprint or framework or expectation, then you might miss a lot of action. I think the really significant thing is in Southeast Asia, and indeed elsewhere, including in established liberal democracies, there are very significant attempts to present alternative forms of participation and political representation to democracy. And some of the things that I've written about in Southeast Asia are about new forms of consultation, new forms of representation, which are attempts to bolster the avenues and options for people to get engaged in politics, are often sites of struggle. People go in there, some looking to exploit these as opportunities for democratic development and to provide new openings, but they are often engaged in struggle against more powerful forces who are also operating in those sites, those institutions, who are seeking to contain them, seeking to limit the range of their claims on the sorts of reforms that should happen. I mean, some of the issues are quite substantial, and you know, the real measure of a democracy, people like Carol Pateman have argued, is it possible to have the authority and the authenticity of decision makers and policies ensuing from those decisions open to full and unlimited inquiry and investigation? Or are there constraints that limit the range of things that you can contest? If you're trying to contest the democratic structures of society more broadly, then that could constitute a whole lot of challenges about gender relations, hierarchical relations in private companies, relations between public and private entities, the extent and nature of civil society, whether or not trade unions should have more or less power. These are big issues that in many cases you can compare different regimes and see that some of those conflicts can be had, in others they can't. And you can make those distinctions across different democracies as well as between democracies and authoritarian regimes. So there are universal struggles going on that I think we need a framework that is capable of breaking free from the constraints of an expectation that democracy is the only game in town. Unfortunately, it's not.
Well, thank you very much. And wrapping up our interview, in your book, Participation Without Democracy, you compare Singapore, the Philippines, and Malaysia. In your opinion, what are the core common aspects in the participation without democracy, specifically in those countries? And what are the main benefits enjoyed by their population in a participation without democracy?
Well, the point really of the book is that they differ. What's common is that they're all facing major transformations because of rapid capitalist development, major upheavals, new social forces, new business interests, new professional groups, declining positions from other groups, lots of conflict over the distributional outcomes. But it varies from one case to the other because capitalism is organised differently in each of those three cases. In Singapore, for example, there's state capitalism married with globalised international private capitalism. In that situation, there are very powerful technocratic leaders who have a particular ideological perspective on how participation should operate. Very technocratic view of political participation. Then in the Philippines, you have a private oligarchy that doesn't operate through state capitalist structures as in Singapore, but exercises enormous private power to constrain, to coalesce and harness state powers to try and achieve its ends. And those ends include trying to contain participatory democracy. And then in Malaysia, well, we've seen most fascinating breakdown of an old set of structures which was grounded on organising capitalism in such a way that political patronage was possible based on ethnicity and religion, and attempts to open up to technocratic forms of participation, consultative representation as I call it, which has been present in both comparatively democratic Philippines and in Singapore, has not been possible within Malaysia. Consequently, people have not been absorbed in co-optive sort of processes with elites to the same degree as in those other countries, and they've gone down their independent path, which in the long run backfired against the elites in Malaysia, because we saw that people over a long struggle of about 20 plus years formed independent, genuinely independent collective organisations that ultimately coalesced into a coalition that brought down the existing government. How far that goes in transforming the Malaysian society and polity remains to be seen, because there are very powerful interests embedded in that form of capitalism and the ideologies that justify it.
Thank you very much for being with us, Professor.
You're most welcome.
Thank you for being with us, and for more information, please visit our website www.internationalaffairs.org.au. Thank you.